words, kind of word studies this summer. And I mentioned a book last week, or a couple weeks ago, 70 Hebrew words every Christian should know. I thought I'd bring it back. If you'd like to take a look at it, I'd be happy for you to take a look at it. If you'd like to check this out from the ACU library, they have a copy. In fact, this is it. And if you really want to check it out, you can't because I have it checked out right now. But it's going back. And so if you want to look at it before you buy it, I assume you could probably find it. This will have a little bit of Hebrew, but it's not anything that you couldn't, it's not like you have to have that in order to glean something from the book. Obviously, with a title like 70 Hebrew words every Christian should know, there's going to be a lot of Hebrew here. In fact, you'll find Hebrew printed in Hebrew, okay? You'll find the actual, and if you can't read the symbols and decode the language, you just kind of have to look at it and go, look at that. And then you move on, okay? The explanations, I think, are pretty accessible. It's not super technical. It's not written for a specialist. It's written for folks who are interested and motivated and want to know more and want to glean some of the riches that the Old Testament has for us, that the language can give us, okay? I should get a commission after an endorsement like that. Okay, I haven't read the whole thing. I've read in the parts that we're looking at.
Did a person do it?
Yeah. This man teaches at, looks like University of Dubuque seminary in Dubuque, Iowa. And he says, I've taught Old Testament, and I love Old Testament, and I think folks in the pew, people in the pew can glean something from a book like this. And so he says, I write this book for those who are interested and motivated. And so he doesn't write it as a seminary professor to other professors. He writes it to folks like us. Okay? Well, last week we talked about covenant and didn't finish. That's okay, because we really need, it's a great segue, let's put it that way, to get into love. I want to stay in the Old Testament with love today, but it piggybacks on the discussion of covenant that we began last week. So at the risk of repeating myself just a little bit, just a refresher on covenant, and then we'll hit the ground running, and I'll complete what we started last week on covenant, and then get into love. Okay. We talk about contracts, treaties, a lot of that in the news lately. Anyone wants to buy a house, you're going to have to negotiate a contract. If you want to sell a car, you need legal documents. You need to be able to demonstrate you actually own the car. You need to transfer the ownership. You need to have a statement of receipt. A receipt of what? At least some type of purchase price or a trade-in value. Informally, you remember the days we talk about you could shake on it and that's good enough, okay? And in a sense it is, until it's not. And that's when you have a sheet of paper that spells it out, that says, you were supposed to do this, this, and this, and I'm supposed to do this and that and the other thing. And here's a time frame that this needs to be done in. If you're going to send payment, it needs to be, it's payment due by the 15th of the month, every month for 100 months, and then this happens or that happens. Okay, so this got some type of stipulation. We'd say fine print. And that's not only for your, it's not only that, it doesn't only always obligate you, it also gives you protection. Okay? Because if any one of us goes to sleep at night and wakes up tomorrow, there's no guarantee we're going to remember what happened yesterday. Sometimes it's just The passage of time blurs your memory. Sometimes people inherit those agreements from others who made them, and they weren't present in the room when the agreement was made. So I don't have memory of this. So again, the handshake is good and it works until it doesn't, and then what? What happens if you have a handshake agreement with your neighbor, and then the neighbors move? Maybe it's an agreement about, you remember I illustrated who mows the strip of grass between your driveways? That's great with your neighbor. What happens when they sell the house and move? Okay? That doesn't transfer unless they write it in the deed of their house, right? Well, the need for the covenant, the need for the contract, the need for the treaty is a relational need that helps define the relationship. Okay? So a covenant is a relational word, and it helps define the nature of the relationship. That's what I'm trying to get at. We talk about marriages as covenants. We don't talk about making a covenant with the used car dealership. We usually talk about a contract with them. But a marriage as a covenant is probably the one place where we retain that language of covenant as opposed to the other synonyms. Okay. Last week, we talked about covenants. And I'd almost, if I would have had another 15 minutes, would have gotten to this quote. Okay. Looking through the Old Testament, we find this term showing up when we talk about the relationship between people. The term is berit, B-E-R-I-T, or B-E-R-I-T-H, if we were to give English equivalents to the Hebrew letters, berit. It's not a term that directly comes across into English. In other words, it's not a term that English kind of anglicized. Amen is a word that English comes out of English almost directly out of Hebrew, where we just give the English equivalents to the Hebrew letters and coin a new English word. We don't do that with berit, B-E-R-I-T or T-H. A person and another person could make a berit. You and your neighbor over the strip of grass. Your nation and the neighboring nation could make a berit. A nation that is on equal footing with another nation. For example, I don't know, well, I'd say for example, it's not a good example because Abilene is bigger than, pick a town, any town surrounding. Maybe, I guess, Abilene and San Angelo. Is San Angelo about the same size population-wise? I had no idea Lubbock was so big. We drove through, it's like 200-something thousand, right? I didn't know that. Driving through to pick up the kids from Blue Haven last week, I thought, wow, that's a lot of people. I guess if I were up there more often, I would notice all of them. It's a big town. Abilene and San Angelo, we're near neighbors. We're about equal in terms of size, at least I think in terms of number of noses in town. I don't know the geography. I don't know what advantages they have. I really don't know what advantages we have, but let's assume we're basically peers. Let's agree to have an understanding, there's that term, treaty, we'd probably say, if we're dealing with civil matters like that, between the two of us to act in each other's best interest. If something comes along that threatens us, our neighbor, was it southwest, right? Is that right? Our neighbor to the southwest has our back. Okay? If something happens down there that threatens them, we're ready to help. You just let us know how we can help. Okay, sometimes you see this when the power goes out. There'll be this line of, linemen, ready to go rescue our neighbors and do electrical work, or there's a fire. We're about equal. And so no party is greater than the other party in terms of no one's got someone else's arm up against their back, you know, kind of muscling them around. Yes?
AI stuff out here has changed Abilene. But I live over in the north part over there.
You know, somewhere I saw a map of all the different places around here, and I didn't realize there's a whole lot of them. Well, talk about arm behind your back. Here we go. Speaking of, there's not much land left in Davidson County, Tennessee, Metro Nashville, like undeveloped land. Near the zoo, maybe next door to the zoo, I haven't followed it very closely, there's some land, enough land that if one were to buy it, one could build a data center on it. And that was the plan until it looks like the powers that be in Metro Nashville government said, we think we could do something else better in the interest of the citizens of this city than have that next door. So they exercised eminent domain and slid right into that contract and said, we'll pay you fair price. This deal is void. And so it looks like it's going to be a precedent-setting set of lawsuits over the relationship between the seller and the buyer and the city, who kind of swoops in and says, eminent domain begins now. Okay, so there's an interesting dynamic. Well, speaking of the contracts or the treaties, let's assume Abilene and Albany, for example, get into an agreement. We're not equals. One of us is larger than the other of us. One of us has more noses in town than the other. One of us outnumbers the other. Probably what? 3-1, maybe? I don't know how many people are up there. Not that many. We have more services than they do, civil services. If we're talking about just things that they may need, in a sense, they could be indebted to us. We could have some muscle in that contract or that agreement where they would not have the negotiating power. However, they may have something that we want or that we value. Let's take it up a notch. What if, talking about the disparity between Albany and Abilene, what if there's a great disparity between Abilene and Fort Worth? Okay, now we're the small guy and Fort Worth's the big guy. What if one thing that we really value that Albany has is a great set of relationships with all of its peers that are its equal peers, all between here and Fort Worth? And what if Abilene had great aspirations to expand to the east? How could we possibly take on Fort Worth? It'd be hard alone, but it would be much easier if we had a coalition of us and all of our little man neighbors who may not have a lot of negotiating power against us, absent our mutual disdain for Fort Worth. In other words, I don't love you, but we hate the same people. So I'll tolerate you for the sake of what I might gain out of this. So you think about how city-states or nations could negotiate we wouldn't say interpersonal relationships between nations, but international relations. In other words, I might act in my own best interest, which is not necessarily motivated by kind feelings towards you. It's motivated by a shrewd calculation against some third person over here. Okay? Those kinds of treaties existed in the ancient Near East. That was a long way to get there. And we got there by eventually going through eminent domain in Nashville. Okay. Those were berets known and executed across the ancient Near East. How do we know this? And I should have brought one. I brought it before. Remember my little clay tablets that I made in art class? Okay. One of those is modeled off a picture of a clay tablet, and it's a covenant treaty. We'd say covenant. It's a berit. And it's the copy of the berit that was held in the state archive. It was like our copy of a treaty that we made with some other group or city or nation. Okay? And so last week I mentioned the form of covenants wasn't just cookie cutter identical everywhere at every time among every group, but there was a fairly common way of framing those, we'd say documents, clay tablets, or framing the record keeping, or we would say the receipt, or your copy of the 100-page contract to sell your house. Sign on this page, even the blank ones. Sign on this page that says this page is blank. That kind of specificity. Usually the covenants will tell a bit of history. Usually the covenants will have some very broad agreement stipulations. Here's what we agree to. Sometimes they'll have a lot of very specific things. Okay, for example, us and San Angelo it's a parity covenant because we're on par. We're on equal terms. Those terms wouldn't necessarily favor either of us as the strong person and the other as the weak person. In other words, we're fairly equal, all things being equal. So we'll deal with each other when it comes to the terms of the berit with fairly equal rights and obligations. Okay? We may have a different dynamic with Albany. If they're dependent upon us, we may say things like, we expect your loyalty. And in exchange for your loyalty, we will offer you protection. If you hear of one of your neighbors speaking ill against us, you are to take our side. We'll just tell you in advance. We don't know what we're going to fight about. Think about going back to junior high. Okay? When you're my friend, you're on my side. Doesn't matter what the fight's going to be about. We'll figure that out later. But you're my friend and you're on my side. Okay? Think of how many junior high fights got worse because you didn't take my side. Okay? That kind of language shows up in the berit documents of, if you catch wind that Hawley is talking with Fort Worth, and your brother-in-law saw someone who heard someone who whispered something one time about Hawley and Fort Worth, and like, you catch a whiff of that, I want to hear about it. And I expect you to take our side. Someone has clear advantage over the weaker party. The berit documents will have stipulations like that. When we get to the book of Deuteronomy, for example, and you look at chapters 1 through 4, it goes through a brief history of how we got here. And first are the Ten Commandments, what we call the Ten Commandments, and then there are lots of specific stipulations later on. Seems like that would resonate with folks who understood the form of covenant making, wherein a very powerful entity made a treaty or a covenant or an agreement with a dependent entity. In other words, one party is powerful, the other is dependent. The specific term is a suzerain. In English, we would call it a sovereign. The other is a vassal. You may have heard vassal from English history. You know, the vassal states of medieval England or the vassal kings. You could be a king, but we all know that your kingship is dependent upon someone else's benevolence. Sorry about that. Someone has left somewhere. and I get a notification. You know, you can check up on all your family. If y'all get in these little group things, if I don't turn the volume off, then I know when people have left. I don't want to know that. What kind of king are you really if your kingship is dependent upon someone else? Like, well, you have independence to a degree. In a sense, if we were looking at other Bereits of the ancient world, Yahweh's covenant with Yahweh is fairly unique. It's not a covenant of parity or equality. It's a covenant of inequality. Okay? Speaking of little towns around Abilene, I think he was from Winters. Some of y'all may have known him. Jimmy Jack Roberts. Does that name ring a bell? J.J.M. Roberts. Went through ACC probably in the 50s. Jack Roberts, Jimmy Jack Roberts, Jimmy Jack McBee Roberts, J.J.M. Roberts had 3 initials. Well, from little old, I think he was from Winters. He becomes a highly respected Old Testament scholar, probably one of the most highly regarded Old Testament scholars Churches of Christ produced in the 20th century. I think he taught at Johns Hopkins. He then taught at, I want to say Princeton. I think Princeton. Highly regarded. I think in retirement he came back to rural West Texas preaching for the little churches that gave him his start. He taught for a while at Austin Grad School down in Austin. He's got a great quote talking about covenants. Okay, so he says, the search for ancient Near Eastern analogs or comparisons or parallels to Yahweh's covenant with Israel has not produced any clear examples of a covenant between a God and his people, or even a very convincing example of a covenant between a God and his chosen king. So, Jack, surveying the literary landscape as the remains from the ruins tell us about covenant making in the ancient Near Eastern world, he says, this idea of a deity making a berit directly with a people is unique with Israel. It's not something the other deities do. You don't find Marduk making a berit with his people, or Baal, or the other deities. Yahweh and Israel in covenant, that is striking. That's not something the other deities show up doing. So when you look at the similarities with, say, Deuteronomy and ancient covenant making, you see there's some parallels in how the form is structured. But the fact that God makes a covenant with Israel, that itself stands out. In fact, deities don't really make covenants with their kings, even much less the people. Point being is, what we have in the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, what we have in the covenant with Israel and Yahweh is unique in the ancient world. Furthermore, what's really unique about it is the monotheism that goes all the way through the covenant with Israel. I am the Lord your God, you will have no other gods before me. As you know from the Ten Commandments, the very beginning and heart, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And all the way through, if you've read Leviticus, you know this. Every few verses in Leviticus, there'll be this terribly specific thing, like very specific. You shall not sow 2 kinds of seed in the field, or you shall not wear 2 kinds of cloth in a garment. Because I am the Lord your God, you are to be holy, for I am holy. And you'll think, boy, that's a very why would we say something like that next to something so specific? I mean, I can understand, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Be holy before I am holy. But for something about the clothes that I wear, that seems, how do I make sense of that? Well, seems like the best way to make sense of that is even the tiniest of details of the covenant relationship emerge from God's identity and his holiness. In other words, the character of God filters down to the most minute specifics of the covenant. It permeates the covenant. This covenant emerges from God's own character. The expectations of the people, laid on the people, emerge from the characteristics of God himself. The reason you are to honor me in how you till your ground and how you wear clothes emerges from who I am. That seems like, and I don't have any way, how Jimmy Jack Roberts is a world-renowned expert. I can't dispute him, okay? He's looked at evidence I can't even translate, okay? He says something like, there are no clear examples. The search for analogs has not produced any clear example of a covenant between a deity and a people. Not even a really convincing example of a covenant between a God and his chosen king. Point being is the covenant with Israel is so unique in the ancient world, where a deity enters into covenant with people to the point of being unique and unheard of. Which is why, to come back to something I mentioned last week, that scene in Genesis 15 when Yahweh says, I make my covenant with you, Abram, to give you a child and make you into a great nation. May it happen to me what has happened to these animals if I violate my oath to you. And the Spirit of God passes between the two halves of this series of animals that we lay out. We cut in half, because that's what you do with covenants. You cut a covenant. We say you cut a deal. Okay? When we say we cut a deal, we're getting at the language that goes back to covenant making in the Old Testament. We're going to cut a deal. When we say it, there is no bloody death of animals involved. When they would cut a covenant, there would be a bloody animal cut right down the middle, one half on this side, one half on that side, and the people would pass through them, literally walk through them. Point being is, if I violate this, may it happen to me what has happened to these animals. Yahweh says, may it happen. I can't appeal to anyone greater than me, so I appeal to my own self. I will honor my word to you. I make a covenant with you. I do what no other deity does this. No other people in their mythologies about their origins and their gods, no other people would conceive of the idea that their deity would make a covenant with them. Usually, covenants in the ancient Near East, parallels with Deuteronomy are interesting, but the nature of them is fascinating. Usually they come about by military force. We say a parity covenant with San Angelo. The subtext is, you know the subtext, right? Neither one of us is powerful enough to overtake the other. Therefore, we'll agree to just kind of keep the hostilities at bay, okay? We can start flexing our muscle against Albany, I don't know, keep going that way, okay? Because we have ambitions. Let's look at the subtext of my illustration. What's driving our context with San Angelo is, if we went head-to-head, toe-to-toe, we'd destroy each other. And so I'll take tolerating them over mutual assured destruction. Okay? But if those are my two choices, it's a foolish thing to fight your equal. okay? I'd rather hate you and live than fight you and die, okay? Usually the covenants between entities in the ancient world happen because of force. It's because we have ambitions against Fort Worth that we'll make a covenant with Albany and the little towns from here to there. It's not because we're kind. It's not because we're gracious. It's because there's an angle and we think we can benefit. And we will exploit that opportunism to our advantage however possible, and we'll strategically negotiate the ground between here and Fort Worth, okay? Or we're trying to resist someone else's opportunism and expansion. Underlying that is brute force. Just absolutely, when it really comes down to it, arm twisted behind your back is a mild way to put it. At the end of the day, what's really driving bereits among nations is brute force and violence. What happens with Yahweh is he makes bereat based on his own promise. This does not happen, or this does not arise out of force. It does not arise out of vengeance. This does not arise out of opportunism. This doesn't arise out of ambition. It arises out of, as we read the narrative in Genesis, it arises out of God's deep concern for his creation to make things right what went wrong. And to do for this people what they did not choose to do for themselves, or even could do if they were to choose it. They could not right this wrong. But what if I right the wrong? That's astounding. In a different category altogether, if we believe Brother Roberts, okay? It's fascinating. The bereat that Yahweh has with Israel is rooted in something other than opportunism or vengeance or self-interest. It's rooted in love. That brings me to love. So our word chesed, and you kind of need to, it's the back of your throat. If we were to write it in English, we may write it as H-E-S-E-D or C-H-E-S-E-D, Hesed. If you were to look, we should actually look at one place. Oh, we got 2 minutes. Not near enough time. I think I know what we're going to do next week. Well, let's just look at Jonah. There's lots of places we could look. Jonah is so good. Page 822 in our Pew Bible. We'll get you there quick. We don't have time to go through the whole story of Jonah. I assume you know, Jonah, go to Tarshish. No, he goes the other way. I want you to preach to Tarshish. I don't want to preach, because if I preach, I know that they'll listen, and I don't want them to listen. I'd rather just sit here and wither up and die and shrivel away as to preach, okay? And the great fish, actually the fish, the word for fish is dog, D-A-G. So we had a lot of fun in Hebrew about how Jonah was swallowed by a great big dog, a great big fish. In a sense, the fish saves Jonah. Right? Remember they throw him overboard? He's about to drown. He says, I'm drowning. And then the fish swallows him. All right, we'll try this again. Go to Tarshish. Okay? Look at Jonah 4, 1 and 2. Okay? Nineveh is awful. Don't want to preach to Nineveh. Sorry, go to Nineveh. Don't want to go to Nineveh. He goes to Tarshish instead. Okay. He walks in, he preaches, and it's fabulously successful. Jonah doesn't like it. Look at the end of chapter 3. So God relented. He didn't do it. He threatens to destroy them. They repented, he relented, and this displeased Jonah, Jonah 4:1, and he's furious. He prays to the Lord, "Please, Lord, isn't this what I thought while I was still in my own country? That's why I fled toward Tarshish in the first place. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger, abounding in faithful love." There's our term. So depending on what English version you're looking at, here our Pew Bible, faithful love, that's chesed. Slow to anger, abounding in faithful love, and one who relents from sending disaster. I did not want to preach because I know that is your character, and I didn't want them to experience that from you, okay? Well, we'll just have to pick up there next week and keep going about love, which is the very beating heart of covenant. That's why I wanted to have the two of them together. And now this will be the third week of getting these two together. And actually, that's going to work great because Lord willing, we'll be out the week after that. So we can kind of wrap all this up and finish love next week. Chesed, his faithful love. We'll pause there for today.